So I'm just introducing our panelists. So Brian Pratt is a senior professor of geology at the University of Saskatchewan, who specializes in the study of sedimentary rocks and fossils. His research incorporates sedimentology, paleobiology, paleoceanography, and paleoclimatology in order to reconstruct the life and times of ancient marine environments. He is an award-winning scientist, fellow of the Geological Society of America, and past president of the Geological Association Canada. So thank you very much for joining us, Brian. And next we have Marc Morano, who's also with us today. Marc Morano is a publisher of Climate Depot and the author of the new book, Green Fraud: Why the Green New Deal is Even Worse Than You Think. Marc also served as senior staff on the U.S. Senate Environmental and Public Works Committee and authored the 2019 book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change, and the films Climate Hustle and Climate Hustle 2. Thank you very much for joining us, Marc.
Thank you.
And Jay Lehr, who will be joining us a little bit later. I'll read his bio as well. Jay Lehr is a scientist with 7 decades of work under his belt in water supply, agriculture, energy, and climate. He has published 31 books on these topics. At 85, he can still be at the top of his game with 14 Ironman triathlons behind him and 25 marathons, and he still plays senior men's hardball baseball. He has been blowing the whistle on human-caused climate change fraud for over 30 years. And we also have Tom Harris joining us. Tom Harris has a bachelor and master's degree in mechanical engineering with a thermofluids and energy focus. He has 43 years of experience working as a mechanical engineer and a project manager, science and technology communications professional, and media and science and tech advisor for a former opposition senior environment critic in Canada's federal parliament. For the past 22 years, he has been working with a team of scientists and engineers to promote a sensible approach to energy and environmental topics, climate change in particular, with the International Climate Science Coalition, ICSC, and the International Climate Science Coalition Canada, ICSC Canada. So thank you all for joining us today, and I'm sure we'll have a very enlightening discussion. So we're going to go on to Tom Harris, and my question is, how has postmodernism affected the climate change debate?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'd like to start with a quote from Lewis Carroll. It's in the book Through the Looking Glass, because it actually summarizes a lot of environmentalism and in particular the climate scare. In the book Through the Looking Glass, the chess pieces come to life, including the befuddled White Queen, who in response to Alice's assertion that one can't believe in things that are impossible, replies, "I dare say you haven't had much practice. When I was your age, I always did it for a half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." And, that really sums up a lot of the climate scare from the point of view of what they're actually saying. I mean, so many of the things they say are simply impossible. Okay, the idea that you can power a modern industrial society with wind and solar power is simply impossible. In fact, it's interesting, they say in California that they have battery backup. David Wojcik, the person we work with, he pointed out that the batteries they have in California are the biggest in the world, and it would supply California for electricity for 102 seconds. So he always says that's just enough time to actually find a flashlight. There are many other things in the environmental debate concerning climate change which are simply impossible. The idea that extreme weather will increase in a warmer world is simply wrong. It's the opposite. As temperature rises because of greenhouse gas emissions, and there is some of that going on, not that it's catastrophic in the least, but temperatures at high latitudes will generally increase more than temperatures at lower latitudes. So the pressure differential, the temperature differential between high and mid latitudes actually reduces, and that's the driver of weather, of course, so extreme weather reduces. Similarly, polar bears, there's 5 times as many polar bears as there were in the 1960s. And you could go on and talk about all these different things. I went to a presentation at the Museum of Aviation a few years ago from Ecology Ottawa. It was called The End of Snow in Canada. And as people know from a previous presentation I gave, I actually went to the microphone and pointed out that snow cover in North America has been rising gradually for decades. Of course, they were super angry and they couldn't accept that. I said, well, check the data yourself. So you have to ask, what is going on that so many environmentalists promote ideas that are literally impossible and in many cases the exact reverse of what is reality? And what's going on in many cases is it's actually what's called applied postmodernism. You see, the Enlightenment started, in the middle between 1000 and today, and it actually had as its basic concepts the idea of the use of reason and evidence to make decisions. And of course, that led to science and the scientific revolution. They also supported representative democracy and respect for alternative points of view and things like that. Well, postmodernism arose in the 1960s, primarily in academia at that time, and they rejected the fundamentals of the Enlightenment. It sounds crazy. I mean, it really sounds like you're dealing with extraterrestrials, but in fact, they really engaged in what they call playful deconstruction. So they deconstructed the very fundamentals of our modern world. Now, that was not terribly dangerous until it actually became applied. Applied postmodernism started to actually influence the real world. And so what you find is that people who got their bachelors of arts in the 80s and the 90s were actually inculcated with this whole idea of postmodernism. Postmodernism, you see, makes as the most important ideas for making decisions as emotions, storytelling, gender identity, that kind of thing, because they regard the world as a constant struggle between the powerful and the powerless. And that all science, all mathematics, all engineering, all of these rational methods of making decisions based on evidence, they reject it all because they say, and this sounds so silly, you have to really learn about it to realize they're serious. It really is an Alice in Wonderland approach. They specifically think that all of these things of the Enlightenment era were generally advanced by white male Westerners. And since they say that is, of course, the people who originated it, then the whole system is systemically biased. So they say, believe it or not, that modern mathematics and engineering and science is all essentially racist. So they want to base their decisions on storytelling and feelings. Now, there's a book called Cynical Theories. Okay, they have the word critical crossed out and the word cynical put in its place. And these are two academics, and I'll send the link to Mary Jean. She can share it with everybody. It's an excellent book. It's on Audible. I listened to it all a few months ago. And they talk about how this is undermining the very fundamentals of our modern world, not just in environmentalism, but in critical race theory and all sorts of things, which are largely based on the whole postmodern concept. So you have to say, well, how do you actually convince people who base decisions on emotion and storytelling and gender identity? How do you convince them of reality in the climate debate? Well, the truth is you can't, because they don't make their decisions based on evidence. They make it based on emotion and storytelling and all that sort of thing. And so what you really have to recognize is the only people you can convince are the audience, people who are watching your debate with an extreme environmentalist. The environmentalist himself is specifically almost like an extraterrestrial. They don't think like you at all. And one of the things I find is that if you can point out to people that they are violating classical liberalism, the fundamentals of our society, the respect for alternative points of view. Of course, as Marc Morano and many people know, death threats are part of the game. They want to shut you up. They don't want to debate. They regard even debate as something which is fundamentally racist because this is a methodology that is used by white male Westerners. I know this sounds crazy, so you really have to take a look at that book. Or an article, actually, that summarizes the book, and I'll share that with Mary Jean as well. And I'll read a quote to you from that book, from Patrick Keeney. He's a visiting scholar at the Center of Multiculturalism and Education Policy at the University of Chiang Mai in Thailand. He said this to me in an email, and he said I could share it. I think that environmental extremism is anti-enlightenment and illiberal and an excellent example of applied postmodernism. The Greta Thunbergs of the world have little time for actual science, which is always defeasible and open to correction, interpretation, etc. The climate activists, or at least a significant portion of them, are well, anyway, they're on a crusade to redeem the world, which is readily divisible into believers and non-believers. In their understanding, one is either a saint or a sinner. There's nothing in between. Increasingly, we seem to think that the science around any topic is settled, So of course they say there's no need for debate, and they just try to shut you up. So that's the important thing to remember. Debating with extreme environmentalists is hopeless with respect to changing their point of view. The only thing you can do is show the audience that they are basing it on a thoroughly non-modern approach to the world, one which would destroy our world if they got their way. So I pass it back to you, Mary Jean.
Great, thanks so much. And if anyone has any questions about this, just write it in the chat, so we'll get to those later. So we are going to go back to Brian Pratt. I have your slides, and so I'm going to share those.
So there's our famous blue marble, and in many respects, I think that it was this picture and this almost this concept is what really triggered what Tom just talked about, extreme environmentalism, where the isolation of the Earth in the solar system and so forth really kick-started things and went way beyond what I remember as a high school student. Next slide, please. The slide that you can see there is the thermohaline circulation of the ocean. So this is really what, besides the sun, what governs seawater temperature and essentially the atmospheric temperature and weather patterns and so on. So next slide. The point here is that just about 5 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama closed, and that made a huge impact on ocean circulation. Okay, so instead of having an equatorial circulation from the Pacific to the Atlantic, it became more of a north-south circulation, and that's really what set up essentially the polar conditions at the North Pole, the frigid conditions, and it's really because of this tectonic process of closing, of isolating the two oceans. Do you want to go to the next one, Mary Jean? So in the Oligocene, which was only 30 million years ago, Australia drifted a little bit farther away from Antarctica. It used to be attached, and that set up the circumpolar ocean current. And that isolated the Antarctic, and that was when the Antarctic became essentially frozen. It was only 30 million years ago. Okay, so again, this is a tectonic process that influenced global climate in an enormous way. Okay, and as I'll tell you later, has really nothing to do with carbon dioxide. Okay, the next picture is a graph that you'll see posted here and there, and it is a way of plotting ground station temperature measurements from the 1800s to the modern times, and at the scale here in degrees Kelvin. And you can tell that one of the startling things about at least temperature, Earth's temperature, is that it's remarkably stable, at least in the human time scale. Okay, and obviously there is no impending catastrophe. And of course, it's not all about temperature. Here's a graph from Climate for You, a great source of information showing the snow, northern hemisphere snow cover over the last. Well, I can't see the picture anymore, but there we go. Since the 90s, measured by satellites, and again, remarkably stable. Yes, up and down a little bit, but remarkably stable. Okay, so we're not in the middle of a really strong trend in any way. So the next one shows you Saskatoon, 50 years apart, and you can download this kind of information from all. It's government Environment Canada data, and you can see basically that in 50 years there's no obvious change in climate. So this would include precipitation as well as weather, and also extreme weather events. Now there are decadal cycles here on the prairies, but and they won't show up in just by eyeballing a graph like this. So the next picture is again from Climate for You, and it's since the end of the Little Ice Age, 1850, and there has been overall a gentle warming. But if you look at the scale on the left-hand side, this is a temperature anomaly. So the difference between a long-term average and it's so small that you would never know if you went outside, and if it was a quarter of a degree more or less, of course you're never going to know. So the next slide takes us back a little bit further in geological time. And so when at the end of the Ice Age, okay, the last glacial phase, we actually had a rapid warming and then a rapid cooling, and that was called the Younger Dryas, and then a rapid warming, and you can see here on this, you can find this graph all over the place, and the temperature rose, the average temperature rose dramatically, and in fact, for a good part of the Holocene, which is in the last 12,000 years, the climate was warmer than it is now, okay, and of course there were different weather systems. So for example, alpine mountain glaciers are all younger than about 5,000 years. So here's a picture of Glacier Park, and people lament the fact that these glaciers are melting, but they aren't very old, and in fact they melted during the early Holocene climate optimum, okay, and so and of course they melted also during some of the interglacial phases as well. And the Sahara was actually a savanna, and I've been even lucky to see these sorts of kind of rock shelter paintings with my own eyes, so they're real. And it was, of course, it was dry and cold during the ice ages, but in the early Holocene, it was green and it was a savanna. Okay, so, and that's over really just a matter of a few thousand years. So we're basically changing the scale of observation. We can't measure these temperature changes and so on to a fraction of a degree. We can't do that, but we can certainly see the trends. Do you want to go to the next one, Mary Jean? So one of the important climate phenomena of relatively recent was the Little Ice Age. Okay, it's not really an ice age by comparison to the Pleistocene, but mountain glaciers grew. There was lots more freezing temperatures in the northern hemisphere. Greenland was abandoned. There was disease and poor harvests and so on in northern Europe. Okay, so that's not all that long ago. It certainly wasn't a very big temperature change, but it was enough, and plus other weather systems, enough to cause quite a lot of misery. The next one, please. Now we go into the Pleistocene, which is 2.6 million years ago to about 12,000. And during the glacial phases, you can see these continental ice sheets. So when water was locked up in these ice sheets, sea level dropped. Okay, and then when these ice sheets melted, sea level rose. And of course, the ice here had a tremendous influence on ocean circulation, and maybe even the melting waters as well. It could have affected a climate over the matter of hundreds to perhaps 1,000 years. Okay, so the last glacial maximum was only 22,000 years ago. And people who have never had a geology course are usually amazed to realize that the landscape around us is extremely young, especially in our part of the world here in Canada. But there's really nowhere in the world where a landscape is older than about 2 million years. Okay, it might not have changed that much, but we can use isotopes to determine that the surface is really quite young. Okay, so it's not a static thing, and this is something that environmentalists and people without the geological framework tend to forget. So the next picture, please. Now, in the ice ages, the general view is that orbital parameters, and here's a textbook type of thing. So the wobble in the turning of the Earth, and then the tilt of the axis, and then the orbit around the sun. These have different frequencies, and it's really the combination of these that drove the ice ages. Okay, now these are called Milankovitch cycles, and they're quite well established. When we go much farther back in time, it's harder to pick them out, and I would say that it's likely the fact that the closure of the Isthmus of Panama and the development of the North Pole ice and so on basically made the signal a lot more obvious. And when the Earth was not nearly so cold, then the signal is muted. Okay, so the next picture here is again just a textbook sort of picture of these all these spikes and so on, and the spikes that go up, those are the those are the warm periods, and the spikes that go down are the cold ones. And this is measured with isotopes in deep sea sediments, and not to look at it in any detail, but during the Pleistocene, and then also beginning in the Pliocene a little bit before that. So only a few million years ago, we started to develop these wild climate cycles. Okay, and we didn't have those for the most part before. Okay, so this is quite a different story. Okay, so a few million years. So at the end of the last ice age, and we started to melt, sea level rose, and so here is the next picture there. Yep. Okay, so on the left-hand side is just measurements from Barbados. It works, and you could see that sea level was nearly 120 meters below what it is now. It rose dramatically. Okay, just really 15,000 years, and then it's tapered off. Sea level rise is in the neighborhood of 2 millimeters per year, so it's very small. Okay, and if you hang out down for holidays in Cuba and so on, the rock surface that you will maybe walk over and as you're looking for a sand beach, that's the highest it's ever been, and that was about 120,000 years. Okay, and then sea level fell, and then it's risen again. Okay, and so the notion of within a matter of years or decades that we're going to basically flood coastal cities and the Statue of Liberty will be drowning, it's really not possible. Okay, we just don't have the melting at that rate. Okay, in fact, we probably got a lot longer to go before we start freezing up again, but we will. The next one, please. So when we now we're going to go back a little further in geological time, and here's a picture of the Grand Canyon. It's a little fuzzy from where I'm looking at it. So we're looking at rocks now. Okay, so it's the signal that's in the rocks. And here, of course, we don't have nearly the same kind of resolution, so it's more notional. Next picture will show another phenomenon that we need to remember, that the continents were in different positions in the geological past. Here, 450 million years ago, they were separated, and there was high sea level and warm seas in the continental interiors. And on the lower right, this is the late Permian. Okay, 200 million years later, the continents are together. This is the famous Pangaea, and we actually have a continental ice sheet over the South Pole. Okay, and we have, of course, geological evidence for that, which I'll come to in a second here. So the next picture is when we look at rocks, we're looking for climate signals. Again, it doesn't tell you a number. Okay, you can't get an exact temperature from something like this, but we have modern analogs and we have the rock record. So the modern analog here is a coral reef, and on the right-hand side is a nearly 500 million year old reef. So that plus other evidence tells us that at least that locality is in Western Newfoundland, was a tropical locality at the time, 500 million years ago. The next one is another indicator of climate is coal. Okay, so here's a beautiful road cut down in West Virginia, and you can see the coal layer towards the bottom, and it's got fossil plants and so on. So that's another indicator for tropical to subtropical and humid conditions. Now the next picture is well, so a beautiful photograph here by Wilfred Thesiger of the Rub al Khali desert, beautiful sand dunes, and on the right-hand side is the famous Navajo sandstone in Utah, and it also consists of essentially fossilized sand dunes. So that tells us that that part of Utah was arid and windy 180 million years ago. And let's go to the next picture. I mean, I could spend hours talking about climate indicators, but this is a very interesting one. On the lower right is a rock that looks a bit like a conglomerate, and it was determined really only about 10 years ago by a friend of mine, actually, that this is probably a glacial deposit. Okay, now where is it? It's in Maryland. in the uppermost Devonian. Well, Maryland was in the tropics. And yet we probably had, at least the rocks are telling us, we had mountain glaciers for a short time. Okay, not very long. Now, anybody who's living in Ottawa and would walk up to the Parliament Hill, avoiding politicians as much as you can, and the balustrade all in front of the Parliament Hill there, the center block, is all made of a sandstone that is related to this conglomerate. Okay, it's quarried out, or was quarried out in Cleveland, and that particular sandstone was probably distal to mountain glaciers in the Appalachians. Completely unexpected up until about 10 years ago. All right, so the next picture, and we're nearly finished the geology part, the fun stuff. So here's a typical kind of graph that shows, so modern on the right and 500 million years on the left. Okay, so if we start out using modern temperature as sort of our baseline, you can see as we go left, we go into about 1 million years, and we have these glacial fluctuations, okay, warming up, sometimes warmer than now, and then getting cold and very cold. And then we gradually start warming up to about 60 million years ago to a very warm time called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And that's one of the warmest times ever, at least in the last 500 million years. Okay, that's called the Phanerozoic. Now, when we go way, way back to billions, maybe there were warmer times globally. Okay, but so this is telling us that all of Earth was much warmer. Okay, not just the tropics. And on the left-hand side, with the yellow and the red and so on, this is when we go back much further in geological time, and I'll talk about that later. But this is again, generally it was much warmer than certainly much warmer than it is now, and only had a couple of cool episodes, and you can see that one around 300 million years, and that was the coolest at the time. So basically, the story is that things were warmer in the distant geological past for the most part. Now, the last slide here is one done by a guy named Chris Cotiz, who's probably the number one expert on putting together plate tectonics and all of that sort of thing. And all he's doing here is the curve on the upper left is the pole to pole temperature gradient. So North Pole on the left, South Pole on the right. So then the South Pole is colder than it is on the North Pole. That's because of the tilt of the Earth. And then times of the rock record, the latitudinal gradient of temperature was often very shallow. Okay, so the whole Earth itself was warmer. Okay, was warmer than it is now. So the Earth isn't a static, and never was a completely static entity. Okay, so that'll do for the geology part until we come back again to talk about the role of carbon dioxide. Okay, thanks, Mary Jean.
All right, great. So we're going to move on to another question. Now we're going to talk to Marc Morano. Do you see climate lockdowns coming in the future, and what would they entail? So if you'd like to let us know about that, that would be great.
Question, Mary Jean. I appreciate that. I'm now turning on my PowerPoint. If I think I could do this, I believe I should. I tried it before. 1 second here. All right, you all see that?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, is it full screen?
Now it is, yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. Well, just a quick comment. You know, this week we have the new UN IPCC report out this week, fresh. At Climate Depot, I have a great analysis of this by climate statistician Dr. Matt Briggs, who says the IPCC reports are wrong for decades, but they're always wrong in the direction our rulers want them to be. You can't be fired for being wrong in the right direction. And I think just listening to the geologic history of the Earth, as we just saw, we realize where the UN IPCC is coming from. But just so your listeners know why this report is being called the Code Red, the great analysis here is Dr. Briggs, the climate statistician, believes that they literally went and did a find and replace of every instance of very likely in the last UN report and changed them to virtually certain, because they're just making the report more extreme predictions. When current reality fails to alarm, they make scarier and scarier predictions of the future. And I think that's what we're seeing here, and that's why the media is going nuts. Roger Pilkey Jr., a extreme weather expert, it talks about how they use the most extreme climate model scenario to come up with all this scare. And you ask, well, what's the reason for this? Why do they want to scare people? It goes right to what you asked me, Mary Jean, about the climate lockdowns, or what you would call a version of the climate lockdowns. So what happened is there's a lead author of this report who literally runs a climate crisis group that's probably, and I can't prove this yet, financially benefiting from his service to the United Nations, at least from the publicity angle. He said the purpose of this report was to get people to vote a different way, to make them aware and make them vote better. In other words, don't vote for climate deniers. And why is this? They want to control. And now you see on the screen here, it says, climate lockdowns is a coronavirus lockdown the future environmentalists want. I did a whole special report on this last October of 2020. And then my book, Green Fraud, actually details 2 chapters on the COVID climate connection, which deals exactly with this. But here's a little history. Richard Lindzen, the MIT climate science, 2009, talking about CO2. It's hard to imagine a better leverage point than carbon dioxide to assume control over a society. It's essential to the production of energy. It's essential to breathing. If you demonize it, gain control, you control everything. So it's kind of like a fundamental attractiveness to the bureaucratic mentality. Now think about that. 2009. And I have news for you. Richard Lindzen was right. CO2 was probably the best thing they had going until 2020. They did imagine it. It's hard to imagine something. Let's go back. It's hard to imagine a better leverage point to assume control. They did end up imagining something better than CO2. The COVID climate reset. This is the pandemic. This is the great reset beneath it. They started out with a flattening of the climate curve, and the flattening of the coronavirus curve, but now climate activists openly talking about, this is the Washington Post in Washington, D.C. We can flatten the climate curve too. Remember, they flattened the curve for 2 weeks? Didn't quite last 2 weeks, did it, folks? And don't expect a climate curve to be flattening, to be temporary either. This was Teen Vogue magazine. If we can shut down the world to stop a virus, it also means it's possible to do the same for climate change. They were jealous. John Kerry, the climate activist, Greta Thunberg, United Nations officials, they were jealous that they had spent decades trying to scare the public. They failed, and COVID came along and terrified everyone. Within weeks, they were able to implement the Green New Deal overnight. John Kerry says, I don't say this in a partisan way, but the parallels between COVID and climate are screaming at us, both positive and negative. You could easily replace the words. So you see what's happening here. They're morphing them. The climate activists were lusting after these lockdowns. The woman in red is the COVID lockdown, the COVID-19. The man represents socialism, and climate change thought that they had a handle on socialism until the virus came along. Net zero, we hear a lot about that. The Biden administration, Europe and Canada. It's like a lockdown, a COVID lockdown, but you know what? It's going to be permanent. And that's the scary thing. Time Magazine 2030 edition. The pandemic remade every corner of society. Now it's climate's turn. Hey, who hasn't loved the last 18 months? It remade our lives, the greatest transfer of wealth. We couldn't go to weddings, funerals. We had the limited travel, stay-at-home orders, no barbecues, no weddings, and no curfews imposed upon us. Time Magazine thinks it's great. Now it's climate's turn. Hey, we got to get in on this fun. Remember what Richard Lindzen said? It's appealing to the bureaucratic mentality, i.e. the progressives, the Marxists, the socialists. Climate lockdowns. What happened? Let me see if I have that quote here. But in 2013, Ivo de Boer, the former UN climate official, actually said the only way we can achieve the climate goals of the United Nations is to shut down the global economy. Bingo! We actually did shut down the global economy. But apparently it wasn't enough for that 18 months or a year that we did it, because now, according to the UK Guardian, we need every 2 years, we need to shut down the global economy to have a chance at meeting our climate goals. Now, remember, we declared a COVID health emergency, the World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control, every country's health experts, all following in line with China. And by the way, guess who's the biggest single funder to the World Health Organization? Bill Gates Foundation. So that just tells you a little bit about it. By the way, guess what Bill Gates just said last week? He wants to see COVID lockdowns modeled after what we're seeing in Australia. And you know what Australia is doing? Zero COVID, much worse than zero emissions. This is zero COVID, pure fascism, where they're locking people in their home. They're flying helicopters over beaches. Beautiful sunny days, people out on the beach getting healthy sunshine, vitamin D, swimming. The health bureaucrats flying over with the police force telling them they have to go in. That's what Bill Gates thinks is the model. And he's the guy funding this. And I'll get to Bill Gates a little later because he's also behind the effort for the climate lockdowns. Senator Schumer, New York senator in the United States Senate, urges Joe Biden to declare a climate emergency. Now think about that for a second. Joe Biden declares a climate emergency. He can suspend elements of democracy and start imposing restrictions. No, we can impose high gas prices. We have to stop these emissions. We're killing people. It's a public health threat. We have just recently, New York State declared gun violence a public health threat so they could start confiscating guns. The Biden administration declared misinformation one of the #1 public health threats. So now they can start censoring Americans and even going after private techs. Do you see where this is going? The climate activists realize that a quick imposition of some kind of emergency powers of government, you can do whatever you want. There's no meetings of legislators. There's no hearings. It's just go, 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 appealing to the bureaucratic mindset. Climate lockdowns. 2021, this report came out in, I believe, June of 2021. International Energy Agency Net Zero report urges behavioral changes to fight climate change. A shift away from private car use, upper speed limits, and thermostat controls, limits on your hot water, and more. Upper highway speed limits. 50% of car trips in cities are shifted to buses, cycling, and walking. By the way, we're seeing this in France. They're actually banning short-haul flights because it's bad for the climate. So you're going to be forced to take buses or trains. You're not going to be driving because they're going after private car ownership, and we'll get to that in a minute. Long-haul leisure travel, less than 6 hours, does not exceed 2019 levels. So we already know there's climate activists out there wanting to limit our travel. Heating temperatures, air conditioning temperatures monitored. This is the climate lockdown, the COVID lockdowns morphing to climate lockdowns. Now, I mentioned earlier about Bill Gates. Well, this is the academics in Australian National University. Climate change is a killer, but we don't acknowledge it. There's a second component which allows for pre-existing conditions. Let's add climate change to death certificates. Now, think about that. Bill Gates is on record in 2020. The actual economic and death toll from climate change will be much, much greater than what we have with this pandemic, unquote. Pause. Bill Gates just said in an interview that the model for COVID lockdowns is Australia. Australia and New Zealand are the most fascist, tyrannical lockdown models we have. Bill Gates is now telling us that climate change is a greater threat with a greater death toll than COVID. Now, I'm asking everyone out there, Mary Jean, think about the implication of that. Bill Gates, largest single funder of the World Health Organization. Bill Gates, the largest proponent of the vaccine mandates and profiting from the vaccine, pushing vaccine passports, is now publicly saying that climate is a greater threat, and he doesn't think America even did enough half measures, or Canada did. We should all be following the Australian tyrannical model. You see what's happening here. This is one of my fake certificates of death. Climate change, cause of death. This is a CNN screenshot, which I dutifully altered. This is actually a COVID death toll. But if you scratch out coronavirus and put in climate change everywhere where they have COVID or coronavirus, you can see where they're heading. This is going to be the media drumbeat. There was already undercover video. CNN is actually planning on moving from COVID to climate to start scaring people. And once they start declaring climate an emergency and they get these emergency powers, you're not going to have a say. You're not going to be able to tell your legislator, don't vote that way. Voting, committee hearings, and congressional vote, that's so old school. Come on, give that up. This is now a new world where people can just impose what they want upon us. Climate change in the United States, new cases of climate change. Now let's examine what this would mean if they add climate change to death certificates. Car crashes. If you die in a fatal car crash, guess what? You could be listed as a climate change death. The federal government under the Obama administration did studies claiming that climate change is leading to more fatal car crashes. The American Cancer Society, you think, oh, this is a scientific institution that's just concerned about people's health and welfare. They just announced in 2020 that climate change is increasing cancer risk, and the American Cancer Society fretting over the carbon footprint of cancer care. Now, let me ask you, if you've been diagnosed with cancer, do you want to be relying upon a cancer society that frets over the carbon footprint of your care? Do you want to go to a doctor who's worried that life-saving treatment could hurt the climate, so he's hesitant to give it to you? Well, guess what? That's our future right now. Organ failure equals climate change. Al Gore touts a doctor in his book, every organ system can be affected by climate change. So guess what? When anyone dies, actual cause of death is almost always organ failure. Your heart's going to stop, brain ceases function. So anyone who dies now anywhere in the world, if you die of organ failure, it's a climate change death. We know that because Al Gore has already laid out the groundwork for it. So you must follow the science on this. If you die from cancer, car accident, organ failure, you could be a death toll statistic. And of course, let's not let reality interfere too much, but the climate-related death risk over 95, 99% drop since 1920. So even if climate change was a great threat, I think we got a pretty good handle on climate change. This is our future. This is what we're facing. It's absolutely terrifying. So with that, I think, is that my time for this question, or should I continue on here?
If you want to take a few more minutes, that's totally fine.
Okay, let me, have I canceled my face back on screen or no?
Yes, you are.
Okay. All right. So the amazing thing about this, though, is I'm going to send a scary note of doom tonight. I'm going to be a alarmist here for a minute, if I can, not on climate, but on what's happening in the world. The UK House of Commons Speaker last year came out and said he was amazed at how compliant the public was with the COVID-19 lockdowns, how people went along with it. 2 weeks to flatten the curve, morphs into 18 plus months. Why not? Mask mandates, vaccine passports, restrictions on every aspect of your life that were unthinkable. And he said, now is the time. This was the UK House of Lords Commons Speaker. Now is the time to move over to climate. Well, we basically have a weakened climate. In my next discussion, Mary Jean, I'm going to get into the Klaus Schwab and the Great Reset and a little bit more into where they're headed with this and the absolute, scary dystopian future we're facing. I don't see us on a good trajectory to fight this right now. We are being hammered, crushed. Opposition leaders all across the world are weak. We have Republicans here in Washington, which are quite pathetic, the leadership on both climate and COVID. And we have many Republican governors who fell ill. My favorite Republican governor to fight this is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. He's in a class by himself. He may have saved America from the COVID lock tyranny because he gave other Republican governors on the fence, the Texas governor, South Carolina governor, the Idaho governor, people who weren't as strong. He actually came out and fought these COVID lockdowns. He's not only fought them, but he's banned lockdowns. He's banned mask mandates. He's banned vaccine passports. That's true leadership. That's the kind of leadership we need. And we also need mass defiance of this. In Europe right now, there's mass protests in France and Germany and England of all these COVID passports and locks. Because if they succeed on COVID, it's a no-brainer that they're going to succeed on climate. So with that, I'll end my thing here and I'll have part 2 later on in the program. So thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much. Certainly a very dynamic discussion and a lot of great info. So we're going to move on to Brian Pratt again. So the next question is going to be, what link, if any, is there between carbon dioxide and temperature? So I will share my screen again so we can have your slides.
Thanks, Mary Jean. Okay, so again, we're going to do a little bit of the science here. So I won't be quite as animated as Mark there, but the atmosphere is only really part of the Earth. Of course, we have the oceans and so on. But if we take we look at the atmosphere, and it's an extremely complicated system, and it's essentially chaotic. And one of the most important things besides winds and the sun, we have the role of clouds, which affect the albedo or the reflectivity of the surface of the Earth, or the near surface of the Earth, and then convection and condensation, which it cause a great deal of temperature change and moving of water vapor around. So the carbon dioxide volume it's 400, well, it's a bit more than 400 parts per million, and that's really only 0.04%. And if you were saving money, and that's the kind of percent return you were getting on your money, you would probably say, you know what, this is really not very good. And essentially, in my view, is I really don't. I find it very hard to believe that a gas that is in such trace quantities can have the might that the IPCC and other promoters and environmental people and biologists and so on who've been hoodwinked by this could actually do that much. The other famous molecule here is methane, CH4, and it's not even 0.0002%. Okay, so it's just over 1,900 parts per million, parts per billion, and the fact that our federal government is spending enormous amounts of money to cap orphan wells and to worry about dramatic methane increase from permafrost melting and so on, it's just simply ridiculous. And not only that, methane has a short lifespan in the atmosphere, and it essentially oxidizes to carbon dioxide. Now, of course, the much more important gas is water vapor. Okay, and now the little note at the bottom there, the amount of anthropogenic CO2 is very, very small. Okay, so can we go to the next slide? Here is the annual mean net surface solar radiation of the Earth, kind of flattened out here, and so the amount of solar radiation or incoming solar radiation is low at the poles, and it gets higher towards the equator, which we all know. But you see that it's actually not evenly distributed, and that's because of clouds. Okay, so the orange color there is the maximum, orange and red, and those are the areas that have the fewest clouds. Okay, so this tells you really that trace amounts of CO2 can hardly have any influence on this at all. It's about water vapor. Okay, so the next slide. Now this is a typical kind of a carbon dioxide diagram, a flux of carbon dioxide on the Earth. This is one that you'll see in the textbooks, and the right-hand side here. And these are little annotations by a chemical engineer named Cow in Australia, and I'm part of a Google group where we discuss a number of things. And these numbers are just fiction. Okay, so they look clever. Okay, you've got numbers right down to exact numbers, precision, but it's rubbish. Okay, so all this stuff on the right-hand side about infrared radiation and absorption and re-emitting and all of that is incorrect. Okay, and yet these diagrams are in all the textbooks, including the ones that I teach from. The next one. All right, so here's again another excellent graph from Ollie Humlem's Climate for You, which comes out monthly, and it's a great resource. Now the zigzag curve, that's the increasing amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since really the late 1950s, when the equipment was invented. It's a spectrometer basically, and this would be Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And we all know that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been increasing. It's a little bit logarithmic, but only barely. Okay, and when you show this curve to people, including scientists, they think that is human driven, but it isn't. Okay, we don't really know where all of that carbon dioxide is coming from, but it certainly has increased about 100 parts per million in the last 70 years. And probably a good chunk of that is coming out of the oceans, because warm warm seawater cannot retain as much as cold seawater, so it emits carbon dioxide. But again, that small percentage is from burning of fossil fuels and other human impacts. So the blue line here, that's the satellite, the University of Alabama at Huntsville. That's the sort of global average. Okay, that's issued by them, and you can see. Well, the large spikes here are El Nino events in the Pacific, and they have a large influence. Okay, so that's a circulation. But you can see that there's only really a positive correlation from the 1980s until about 2000, and then there is no correlation with rising CO2. Okay, so a graph like this tells you simply that CO2 in the atmosphere has almost nothing to do with. So if we, the next one. Okay, so here is a picture from the Energy Matters website. Unfortunately, it's not operating anymore, but it's a great resource by Ewan Mearns. And so if we start 450,000 or 400,000 years on the right, and we go to modern times here. So this is a series of ice ages here. So the temperature rise is the top, is the spikes that go up, and the temperature fall are the spikes that go down. And so the temperature spikes, the temperature is shown in red, and the carbon dioxide concentration by volume is shown in blue. And this is based on the Vostok ice core from Antarctica, which is the oldest ice we have. Okay, just over 400,000 years. And the point here is that the rise in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but here it's in inclusions in the ice, is offset most of the time from the rise in temperature. Okay, so the rise in temperature precedes the rise in CO2. Okay, because warm seawater doesn't hold as much CO2, so it's degassing a little bit. So this tells you that the CO2 did not drive the rise in temperature. It was the other way around. Okay, so now if you're like Al Gore and you show this picture from a distance, it doesn't look like that. You can't see the details. So when he stands there on the stage and he points to this graph and all the rest of it, it really, well, it's mendacious actually. Okay, so it's simply not true. But from a distance, it looks like it is true. So the next slide, Mary Jean here. Okay, so let's go back a little further. Now this time, modern is to the left, and old is to the right. Okay, and so this is a fairly recent graph that shows what we think the carbon dioxide concentration was in the atmosphere going far back in geological time. So the sort of yellow one is a model, and it's called GeoCarb. And that was basically a model put together 30 years ago and then updated by a guy named Bob Berner, who was a famous geochemist. And if we just look at the darker yellow line, you can see it was higher towards say 200 million years, and then it dropped. It's around 300 million years, and then rose dramatically into about 500 million years ago. Okay, now it's a model, and the error range is the light yellow around that dark yellow line. Okay, and it basically, the older part was a model based on weathering rate. Okay, and the idea is that weathering will release carbon dioxide basically. So that, we won't go into the details here. Now, other people have used different models. Okay, and you can see there's a purple one here, and it doesn't have that high atmospheric concentration. In fact, it barely gets to about 1,000, so just double what we have now. Okay, so we're sort of got two extremes here. Now the little dots with the lines on, That's by using plant proxies, the plant stomata. So fossil plant stomata diameter is related to the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, because of course CO2 is used in photosynthesis. And you can see they're all over the place as well. Okay, they certainly looks higher in, say, around 200 million years, and higher around 400 million years, which is really about as old as we get plants, just into the Ordovician. Okay, so that particular curve is not far off from the geocarb curve. Okay, but we can't go any further back than the oldest plants. But there's a great deal of uncertainty here. So we're not able to say that we can say that the CO2 in the atmosphere was generally more, okay, and potentially 10 times more, okay, or more. But it's very difficult to say. And people who are, let's say, climate skeptics, like most of us here today, sometimes forget that the great deal of uncertainty in estimating the climate of. We can't go out and just measure CO2 in a rock or anything like that. Do you want to do the next one, Mary Jean? Okay, so here's another nice diagram I found just the other day. And so this reverses the time scale, okay? So 500 million years is at the left and modern is at the right. And the upper part of the diagram is pretty much what we just saw. There's got a pretty much the same diagram here, but it's got tectonic activity thrown in. So in other words, mountain building, and then weathering, and so on. And the diagram on the bottom is based on some on isotopes and geological evidence for this. So it's not really modeled. Okay, it's the actual evidence. And what's interesting about this diagram is that the top part in blue shows periods of what we think were ice ages in the past, okay, and maybe times where not so much polar ice, but certainly some ice, okay, and that's shown in light blue. Now these are based on geological proxies, kind of like what I just showed you with the rocks. They can be disputed to some extent, actually. Okay, so you can, the old story about geology, you can put 3 different geologists on an outcrop and you'll get 10 different answers. So a lot of this is really not that certain. Jan Weitzer, who's a great skeptic who had death threats when about 20 years ago, he and colleagues suggested that the sun was the main driver of climate change, and so on. It's quite astounding, actually. So his curve is based on isotopes, and that's the red one. Okay, so you can see so that's oxygen isotopes, which is the one signal for temperature. Okay, but whether the isotope is measured is actually giving you sea surface temperature or not, it's not always clear. But I just wanted to basically point out here that none of this has anything to do with carbon dioxide, and yet but it's very difficult when we go back to the distant geological past to really have a really good handle where we're completely certain. So the last slide. Okay, so this is again, it's got now and the future on the right, and up to 65 million years towards the left. Okay, and this is just a color diagram with some spelling mistakes. I didn't put it together, but so basically 30 to 65 million years ago was a hot house or a warm house, so very warm. So again, that peak there is the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, one of certainly the hottest of the last 70 million years. Things cooled down, again, likely due to plate tectonics. And then we've got the ice house conditions through the Pleistocene. Okay, so that's kind of dark blue. And then things are warmed up through the Holocene, where we are. And on the right-hand side are the IPCC predictions, the different scenarios. And no geologist would look at this and think that any of that is plausible, other than perhaps maybe that in the coming decades we could have a rise in a single degree of average global temperature, whatever that is. So these scenarios here are just completely ridiculous. They're based on models and not based on observable geological and atmospheric processes or paleoceanographic processes. So again, the notion that CO2 concentration of the atmosphere it has driven this climate scenario for the past 65 million years, where we do have pretty good understanding of the temperature, is just nonsense to think that CO2 drove this. One final comment that I'd like to make when I tell this to students, I say, my friend from Tucumán, Argentina, flew here for an interview. It was plus 45 when he left Tucumán. He landed in Buenos Aires, changed planes, flew to Toronto, changed planes. And when he got here, it was minus 40. I had to bring a jacket and all the rest of it and boots and everything for him. So what's the average global temperature with those two data points? Well, it's like almost zero. So that doesn't mean anything at all. Okay, that's really how using numbers like that, just averaging over the globe, even though it can be done now with satellites, really doesn't tell us that much about climate at all. Now, if we put in Buenos Aires, the temperature that day, and then Toronto, it comes out to be about plus 5. Okay, that would be the average temperature with those 4 data points. Again, it doesn't mean anything really. So I think you have to come away with looking at these graphs is that they're a very, very short time scale, at least the ones that we see in the IPCC, very short time scale. And the numbers are so over precise. Okay, you can't go out and feel a difference in, maybe not even in 1 degree actually, but certainly not fractions of a degree. And this is sort of a final comment that, we don't, most of geology, we don't do things at that precision except some geochemical analyses, because we know that it doesn't mean that much. Now, it's not true with some of the geochemistry. But anyway, so that's really kind of a Cook's tour through some of the geological evidence. And basically, it shows really I don't think, any role at all for CO2 in global climate or even regional climate. So thanks, Mary Jean, for doing that.
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to actually move on to Jay Lehr. So he's actually on the phone with Tom. So is he on right now?
Yes, he is. Can you hear Mary Jean, Jay? Hey, Jay?
Let me first say, Mary Jean, I agree with everything Brian said. I got to hear his explanation of the geologic record, and he is absolutely spot on. I wouldn't have changed a single word, and I agree with everything he said. It was excellent.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And thank you for joining us. So I'm going to ask you a question about what are the benefits of carbon dioxide, and should we be producing more? So this kind of ties into what we were hearing from Brian Pratt about carbon dioxide in the historic record.
The reality is everything is upside down in the world today. We live on this planet because of carbon dioxide. Without it, there would be no plants. Without plants, there would be no animals. There would be no humans. And the fact of the matter is, carrying further from the geologic record that Brian showed, we have been desperately below the amount of carbon dioxide that would be optimum for plant life and human life on the planet. We know 100% for sure that average plant life on Earth requires 150 parts per million carbon dioxide. We got down to 180. Before World War II, we're at 280, precipitously low. We need more carbon dioxide. And what has really saved the planet and life on it has been the burning of fossil fuels, which has provided carbon dioxide emissions that have brought us from 280 around the end of World War II to about 417 today. And the vast billions of dollars that Canada and other countries plan to spend to stop using carbon dioxide and get rid of the carbon dioxide in the air is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. We want more carbon dioxide. The day may come when one great Canadian, Patrick Moore, has said that we'll be crushing carbonate rocks in order to put carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere because we need it. As a result of the increase in carbon dioxide, nearly 50% of the planet is getting greener. It's wonderful. I mean, we have been told by people that really want to destroy life as we know it, that wants to bring us back to life in Canada and the United States of 1850 in terms of the standard of living. They want to, for reasons I will never understand, want to destroy life as we know it and go backwards when everything is opposite. I mean, it's like whatever these people are saying in Canada, they want to go to net zero. In other words, no carbon dioxide emissions is pure insanity. And yet they own the press, they own the government administration in Canada and the United States, and they have been able to get a vast majority of the public to believe in the insanity to be self-destructive. Now, everything they want to do can never happen. It's not technologically feasible to have life without the benefits of the fossil fuels. Every single listener to this radio station, if they look around the room they're sitting in, I can tell you that 85% of every item they look at has an element of petroleum in its manufacture. Everything would disappear. So it isn't going to happen. But on the way in Canada to have net zero and eliminate carbon dioxide and think that it is a bad thing in our atmosphere, it's a bad thing for life, is going to be extremely costly, be extremely painful to every citizen in Canada. None of their goals can be reached, but the damage done on the way will be severe, and every Canadian citizen will experience it within the next couple of years.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jay. That's a lot of really great information, and hopefully that doesn't come to pass. So we're going to move on back to Marc Morano. And I'd like to ask you, how are the climate change policies and impending lockdowns leading toward communism? So you did touch upon that briefly, and Jay did as well. But if you could give us more information about that, that would be great.
Well, let me add that this really has nothing to do with science. It has nothing to do with carbon dioxide. It has to do with controlling the entire population of Canada and the United States. It has to do with replacing a relatively capitalist economy in both nations and installing a total socialist government and economy, ultimately leading to communism. And if one was to study the Marxist revolution in Russia in 1917, you would see everything going on in those decades from the beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 to parallel exactly what is being done in Canada, in the United States, by the governments that are currently in control. They will ultimately fail. I am totally optimistic that eventually the population of Canada and the United States will rise up and throw these people out and install a more sensible government, more sensible science as it relates to the use of fossil fuels, the benefits of carbon dioxide. Sadly, it's going to take a few years, and along the way, every citizen of Canada and every citizen of the United States is going to be punished. However, maybe that's what one has to do. In order to climb out of a bad situation, you got to get to the bottom of the hole. And the governments of Canada and the United States are digging that hole very deep. But more and more percentage of the Canadian citizenry and the American citizenry are beginning to recognize what is wrong with it. Are beginning to recognize that their standard of living and the costs of living are increasing with no benefits at all. And they will rise up. In the United States, I could not be more optimistic. We have a midterm election coming up in November of 2022. That's just 14 months away. We are very lucky in the United States that the House of Representatives controls every nickel that is spent by the government. The government can say anything they want to do, but if the House of Representatives does not approve it, that money doesn't get spent. And while the Democratic Party, the Biden administration, has a 4-vote majority in the House of Representatives, that majority will go by the wayside in November 2022. The Republican parties will take full control of the House of Representatives, and the pendulum will start to swing back. I'm less knowledgeable of how things work within the Canadian government. It might take longer, but I am sure, knowing so many Canadians, having traveled in Canada, I am confident that the people in opposition of Mr. Trudeau will increase in numbers, and the time will come when his administration will be thrown out and more knowledgeable people will understand the science that Brian so well put forth to show that the models that try to say that things are what they are not are of no value at all, and the geologic record will support the proof that we have zero problem with increasing carbon dioxide, and in fact, we have quite significant benefits.
Thanks so much, Jay. We're just going to go over to Marc now, and we'll continue the discussion. Thank you.
Okay. I agree with everything Jay said, except I think we might disagree on his optimism. I will present a much more pessimistic view just because I don't think Republican win in midterm is going to save us, and I don't think democracy is going to save us. Okay, this is my book, The Green Fraud. I have 2 chapters on the COVID climate connection, and the question was about Marxism and central control and communism. So I'm going to start out here, and this is how I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about climate and a little bit about COVID and a little bit about the lockdowns. Can everyone hear me and everyone sees everything, correct?
Yes, everything's good.
Okay, that's my book, Green Fraud. Okay. What happened, and I alluded to this earlier, overnight with COVID, we had everything the Green New Deal advocated for happened in America and the world overnight. I mean, the economic degrowth, planned recessions, the crushing of travel, the forced reduction in emissions, ruled by expert people, micromanaging every aspect of your lives, which is all part and parcel of the Green New Deal. And I like to say coronavirus is mutating, since we're on the topic of Marxism. That, of course, is the coronavirus. And you see what's happening. This is happening globally. I alluded to earlier what's happening in Australia, New Zealand. The model, by the way, for Bill Gates. And it's really nothing short of that hammer and sickle. In 2009, Tom Friedman, New York Times columnist, one-party democracy. And he writes here, one-party autocracy certainly has its drawbacks, but when it's led by a reasonably enlightened group of people, as China is today, it can also have great advantages. The one party can just impose the politically difficult but critically important policies needed to move a society forward. Now, think of Anthony Fauci, think of AOC, think of earlier when I talked about a declared climate emergency, a COVID emergency. This literally is what they think they're doing. They're trying to help us. Don't you see? This is ruled by expertology. Experts, and that's not a real word. It's a word made up by Dr. Matt Briggs, statistician. But expertology is experts saying, we don't need you to vote on it. We don't need the messiness. We need a one-party rule. And what is today's post-COVID lockdown? What is our one-party rule? Our one-party rule is the public health sector in every country, in every state, in every county in the world. Public health is ruling. They don't need the governor's help. They don't need legislators. They don't have public hearings. They're not voted for. Most people don't even know who these people are, but they issue guidances that every politician is quaking in their boots because they don't want to be labeled a grandma killer. And this is what Tom Friedman, New York Times, why they praised China, the progressives who are literally in charge of public health, the same way they're in charge, at least in America, of the public education, national education. These are all ruled by progressives. This is what is behind their public health advice, their climate, and their educational. So this is it. Now, Christina Figueres, I alluded to this earlier, she lamented, this is 2013 or 14, lamented U.S. democracy is very detrimental in the war on global warming. She lauded one-party rule. China is, quote, doing it right on climate change. Why? Let's look a little deeper. China is able to implement policies because its political system avoids some of the legislative hurdles seen in countries. Now, remember, all these liberals, progressives, behind that love the lockdowns, that love COVID-19 and want to morph it to climate lockdowns, they love one-party rule. Why? Because one-party rule does not get in their way. They don't want the messiness of democracy. And this is what we're facing right now. Marxism's new face, the climate lockdown. Study claims Americans' energy use needs to be cut by 90%. We need to live in 640 square foot house, fly once every 3 years, limit our purchase of new clothing. We need to go to a plant-based diet. We need collective transport, universal basic income, and economic degrowth. This report is from European researchers led by the university elites, published the end of June of this year. Degrowth is an idea whose time has come. Now, I'm going to go back to what Jay Lehr said. I mean, the Republicans in midterms aren't going to do squat, I don't think. I just think they're going to go up there. I mean, we have Kevin McCarthy, the leader of the Republicans right now. He's up there saying climate's a problem. We need to plant trees and carbon capture. That's the way to solve it. But they don't challenge the narrative on anything, and that includes COVID. Let's continue. UK-funded report 2019, absolute zero. Stop flying, no new roads, stop eating beef, stop doing anything that causes prohibitions on CO2 similar to asbestos. Fascinating. And this is just some of the excerpts from the report. No more trains, no new roads, airport closures. The Ecologist magazine in 2020, the report recommends a radical transformation in the way we live. All shipping phased out by 2050. In Britain, all airports except Heathrow and Glasgow have to close by 2029. Now, we think this might just be the fantasies of the academic left at a university. No. UK-funded report, and once climate is declared an emergency, once we have daily death tolls, once people are literally scared to death about every storm, hurricane, flood, drought, or that we caused it, it's going to be the same mentality. How dare they violated lockdown? How dare they went in a Walmart without a mask? They're killing people. How dare you're driving an SUV? You're killing people. How dare you flew to Florida for a vacation or the beach? You're killing people because of your emissions. This is not very far-fetched at all, and we're not going to have that much of a say in it because it's going to happen again in the bureaucracy. They have their model of COVID-19 modeled after China. And by the way, when China started locking people in their homes in February and January of 2020, the world fell like lemmings off of it. The World Health Organization, with its China-installed leader, did an investigation, and their results after like a week of studying what was happening in China said, everyone needs to copy China. They have the best mold. And unprecedented public health, we started locking down, and everyone accepted it. There was no resistance. A Gates Soros Ford Foundation funded professor, Mariana Mazzucato, floated the idea of climate lockdowns with bans on red meat, extreme energy use. Again, this was last fall in October. This is where they're headed. This is the people behind the endless COVID-19 lockdowns, behind the one-party rule. We are under one-party rule. It's called public health. New Zealand, just to give you an example, again, who Bill Gates, a COVID expert, I put that in quotes, pushes climate lockdowns. We can do this for climate change. This is her talking about COVID-19 just in April of this year. Your CO2-laden breath is killing people. This just came out about 2 weeks ago, middle of July. Science says so. 3 Americans create enough carbon emissions to kill 1 person. For every 4,400, almost 4,500 metric tons of CO2 produced, 1 person globally will die. Now, imagine your kid comes home from school. He's all masked up. He's been in a plastic bubble. He played his instruments in a plastic crate, sealed off from the world, and he sees the air conditioners on too high, or dad driving his pickup truck home, and he says, "You're killing someone. Look, we already know that we're exhaling CO2. We're killing 1 person globally. 3 Americans are killing 1 person." This is how they're modeling it after climate. This is the new face of Marxism. World Economic Forum, I alluded to this earlier, the Great Reset, the pandemic, and by the way, I don't call it the pandemic, I call it COVID-19, represents a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world. The world must act jointly and swiftly to revamp all aspects from education, social, and working conditions. It's time for a great reset. And it's a reset to fix a bunch of challenges. First among them, the climate crisis. This is Al Gore, this last quote. Al Gore is now touting the Great Reset to fix climate change. This is Justin Trudeau, your Canada premier. The pandemic has provided an opportunity for a reset, our chance to accelerate, to reimagine economic systems that address global challenges like poverty, inequality, and climate change. John Kerry, our climate envoy for the Biden. This is the big moment. The World Economic Forum is going to have to play front and center role in refining the reset, all of which is laid bare as a consequence of COVID-19. Greenpeace, we need to ask what can be done differently. And they're talking about pushing the reset button. Every environmental group is excited. The UN Secretary General is a welcome recognition. We have a great wake-up call. Now, who is this Antonio Gutierrez? He's the former president of Socialist International. I would like to see a show of hands, not that I can see him, but a show of hands. How many of you knew the UN Secretary General was a former president of Socialist International, and he's front and center on this new IPCC UN climate report, touting it as code red for humanity? Does anyone ask, who is this guy and what's his background? And why does he seem so interested in climate, creating a Marxist socialist utopia? Klaus Schwab, every country from the United States to China must participate in the reset. From oil and gas, they must be transformed. We need a great reset of capitalism. Now, gee, do you think it's going to look like capitalism after they reset it? Every industry, farming reset. Now, I mentioned Bill Gates earlier about how he's the #1 funder of the World Health Organization, how he wants us to all to model after COVID. By the way, he wanted lockdowns to continue in the United States. And at the same time he made that comment, he's bidding on the world's largest private jet transport program. Now, just think about that. Bill Gates is telling people they have to stay locked down for their own good. He's telling people we need to model ourselves after the most fascist, tyrannical aspects of New Zealand and Australia. At the same time, he's got his own private jet, and he's bidding billions of dollars for the world's largest private jet transport, because it's not going to affect him and Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos, Walmart CEO. They're not affected by any of this. So what else is Bill Gates up to? This is NBC News from about, June 2021, this year. Young farmers going against billionaire investors. Who can compete with the likes of Bill Gates? More we see farmers turning into renters. More farmland can be gobbled up. Bill Gates is the largest single owner of farmland in America. He's not this is NBC News. I just want to make sure that this is not Alex Jones. 2021 and 2020 were the year conspiracy realities outnumber conspiracy theories. NBC News, June 9th, is reporting Bill Gates is not the one in overalls. He's not the one on the tractor. He's the landlord here. Bill Gates, now America's biggest farmer. And Bill Gates, what does Bill Gates want? Well, diet reset. Here he is bragging that he drank water made from human feces. I put this in more for comedic effect, but this is what Bill Gates is about. Bill Gates is also pushing eating fake processed vegetable meat, vegetable oil-based fake meat, as well as Al Gore. The World Economic Forum, which is in Davos, which is behind the Great Reset, encourages drinking reclaimed sewage and eating weeds. Weeds can be tasty and nutritious. And by the way, you better enjoy those weeds, because they're doing everything possible to stop eating of meat. The UN did a huge agricultural report. Al Gore did an IPO time for all of the political action, became one of the biggest IPOs. He's possibly going to become, Al Gore, the world's first fake meat billionaire, okay? And Bill Gates, go back. He's touting drinking water from feces. The World Economic Forum is talking about drinking reclaimed sewage. And they're going to have the power to do it. Bill Gates is going to be the #1 owner of the farmland. He already is. He's not the one in overalls. They're going to make meat so expensive. That's the stated goal of climate activists, to make meat so expensive that people have to look at alternatives like fake plant-based meat, reclaimed sewage, and also the not only weeds, but insect eating. This is the great diet reset. World Economic Forum provides fake meat from a printer. Machines can print up to 6 kilograms of meat an hour. Imagine that. You got some extra gas. Don't worry, I can put the printer on. I'm going to print you some meat here, and it'll be out in a minute, except it won't be real meat, okay? Why eating insects? Why we all might be eating insects soon. World Economic Forum. Is anyone getting the picture here? I am Mr. Pessimist, okay? Let's go with that. World Economic Forum. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy. And this was their video. They're all excited about this great reset. Klaus Schwab, the president, we must build new foundations, would ensure investments such as equality and sustainability. The fourth industrial revolution will affect the very essence of our human experience. They're talking about literally a digital revolution that's going to be a blurring of the lines between physical, digital, and biological. Again, this is the World Economic Forum. These are direct quotes. I'm not quoting Alex Jones or anything like that. They're talking all about stuff. I won't get into this tonight here, but this is some of the stuff. The World Economic Forum believes essentially that they can, keep you alive against involuntary death. But here's the more relevant stuff. There will be a global price on carbon. It helped make fossil fuels history. World Economic Forum, part of the Great Reset. The U.S. won't be the world's leading superpower. Now, think about that. This is what the Biden administration is following to a T. What has happened in the last 8 months? And I know President Trump left President Biden a world where the United States was energy dominant, not independent. I use the word dominant. For the first time since Harry Truman was president and Dwight David Eisenhower in the 1950s, America had more energy exports than imports, more energy production than consumption. We had the world's largest oil and gas producer. President Biden comes in, he cancels Canadian Keystone Pipeline, other pipelines. He starts going after mining and drilling on federal lands. He's going after fracking, the death of 1,000 cuts. And now because of higher gas prices and the Colonial Pipeline Act, he's begging OPEC to increase oil production. Russian oil imports to the U.S. are now nearing record highs. We're now turning over all of this for electric car and mandates and for their batteries. We're going to be relying more on Chinese rare earth mining. So you see what's happening here. We are now going to go back in the United States to being dependent on China, Russia, and the Middle East for oil. And yet they have the gall, John Kerry and Joe Biden, climate change is a national security threat. It's the greatest existential threat, our biggest national security. No, their energy and climate policy is the biggest national security threat. And this is why Joe Biden is doing the bidding of the Great Reset with Build Back Better. The U.S. won't be the world's leading superpower because we're hacking ourselves, cutting us off at the ankles, the knees, and eventually the waist. And this is why I'm not optimistic right now. Papers, please. This is the other thing it's leading to. This is World Economic Forum, a climate activist with I believe it was Al Gore's group, has come up with this COVID app that's going to force everyone to have a COVID passport in order to travel. If you'll be a second-class citizen unless you have this passport, your blood will be screened, and it'll ensure non-infectious people. I've heard you heard a lot about that. How they turn public health. I'm going to do a little bit because this is a very big part of this Marxist, socialist, Great Reset transformation. Fascism is actually corporate fascism, corporate government partnership. This is their vision. You have the vaccine, you get a healthy passport, you're healthy. The guy on the left is healthy. You don't get a vaccine, you're ineligible, you're considered unhealthy. This is the new science. And if you get your vaccination, you think you have your green pass, you're free. You go from one small cage to a bigger. And I think a lot of people are seeing that. I was watching TV hosts all upset that they're still being quarantined and everything, even though they had the vaccine. You're being conned, misdirection. This is what they do. Naomi Wolf, former Clinton advisor, talking about the digital products. this is my favorite quote. This is not Chinese communist style social credit system now in the future. It's Chinese communist style social credit system now in our world. It's a digital product. Apple Pay, Google Wallet, Microsoft, all these big companies, they're going to embed this certificate into your apps on your phone. This is what we're facing right now. And believe this is invented and backed by climate activists. This is our future. They're going to have, in the UK, they talked about having CO2 ration cards. In other words, you're going to have an app or a card that says how much energy and whether you're in good standing or not. So if you have your thermostat set to, too cold in the summer, too warm in the winter, if you have a gas guzzling car, if you take too many plane flights, you're going to have a lower score there, and you're going to be low on the social credit score. This is what we're facing. Republican Party is not going to save us. German economic professor, earlier totalitarian regimes needed mass execution concentration camps to maintain their power. But now, with the help of new technologies, dissenters can easily be identified and marginalized. The nonconformists will be silenced by disqualifying divergent as morally despicable. What's the number one public health threat in America right now? Biden administration declared public misinformation. You can be silenced. This is how you're going to be marginalized and silenced. And now they're talking about planning for a permanent pandemic for COVID. They're just not going to let this go. Masking permanent, social distancing permanent, firms of lockdown. In Australia right now, they've set open quarantine camps. And one of the quotes today was very chilling from the Australian government, which again, Bill Gates' model for America, is you have to be prepared at any time for a COVID hotspot. So a public health official, unelected, not facing any reprisals, can just declare that day there's a new public health threat. Immediately, you may be qualified for further testing, quarantining. This is the world in which we face, and they think it's perfectly acceptable. Rod Serling, Twilight Zone, 1961. This is not a new world. It is simply an extension of what began in the old one. It has patterned itself after every dictator who has ever planted the ripping imprint of a boot on the pages of history since the beginning of time. Like every one of the superstates that preceded it, it has one rule. Logic is the enemy. Truth is a menace. This was a great Twilight episode called The Obsolete Man. This is our world. We are living in the Twilight Zone. To learn who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticize. That's true in the climate world and the COVID lockdown world. Looks like you've had a bit too much to think. We now have the thought police, the Biden administration talking about monitoring people's texts. And this is this is again, COVID-19. You stop whining about civil liberties. A police state is a safe state. And by the way, Anthony Fauci just this week, again, form of tyranny that Joseph Stalin would have blushed under this level of control. He actually said on TV, Anthony Fauci, head of the NIH, I know people want their freedom, but we just can't allow that now. He's acting as though he's the dictator, and he's not, and he's right. They're not going to allow it if he says they can't allow it, because no politician in power will stand up to him except a few like Ron DeSantis or Kristi Noem. Daddy, where were you when the state took away all our rights and freedoms? And here's the answer. I called anyone who questioned it a conspiracy theorist and clapped like a monkey. So what I'm urging you all to do tonight is do not clap like monkeys. We have to fight this, and it begins with personal defiance. I'm part of CFAC. This is how you can reach me. The Berlin Wall did not come down because the East German parliament voted to say, hey, let's give the people their freedom. 40 years is enough. Let's free them. It came down, the Berlin Wall, because people no longer gave their consent to tyranny. And that is my message for you. I'm not optimistic that, another Tea Party revolution or Republican Party can actually make a difference with America or with the world right now. And I just can't believe what I'm seeing happening. I think we need to encourage the mass civil disobedience protests we're seeing in France, England, Germany. They are going to keep this. The biggest thing that's happening with the COVID climate connection is they are now saying that unchecked climate change will lead to more viruses. So they're using climate change to say we need these forms of lockdown. We have to keep people locked down, limited travel, limited car ownership. There was a Canadian environmentalist who called for the end of private ownership of pickup trucks just about 2 weeks ago. And his reasoning is people don't need a pickup truck. They're gas guzzlers. They can go rent one if they need to haul something. This is our reality now. It's not necessarily our future, but this is what we're facing. And I just want to say that one last thing, environment, social governance. You're going to wonder why a lot of these energy projects aren't going to be happening in the future. That's because behind the scenes, we have a governments around the world implementing this environment, social governance, which means banks, financial institutions aren't going to finance fossil fuel projects because they'll have to pay higher interest rates. They'll get lower Chinese-style social credit systems. This is our world. Joe Biden knows the Green New Deal is not going to, he does not want it to face an up or down vote in Congress. He's implementing it through every cabinet agency of the federal government, including Treasury, Interior, State Department. He also knows that this infrastructure bill, which was a lot of Republicans ended up supporting, which is horrible, also is only 5 to 10% roads and bridges. The rest of it is very new Green Deal style. So we live in a one-party state right now. And I don't see one election cycle, 2 election cycle. Even if we had another Donald Trump, I don't think Donald Trump is going to be able to reverse what's happening in the administrative state. We're now under rule by experts. This is a game changer. This is not 5 years ago, 10 years ago. We are in the fight of our life. The great Milton Friedman, I'll end with this quote. He said, throughout history, the history of mankind basically is one of people being oppressed. It's a very few glimpse in the human history where people have been free, like the American experiment and like what we see in Canada and Europe. And that window is rapidly, rapidly closing. So with that, you can all gouge your eyes out and have a great evening. Thank you. Sorry, I'm trying to be optimistic at the end there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. Very, very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
I think that since we're coming up to 9, that it would be best to go on to the question period. Now, we do have a few questions, people in the question period, in the question queue, I should say. So, Tom, I know I was going to ask you a question, but if you don't mind, if we just go to the question period? Yeah, okay,
that's fine. Good.
All right, so first you had your hand up quite a while ago. Hopefully you remember your question. Yusuf, if you're still here, you can turn on your mic and ask a question.
Okay, so I don't know if I have to have the video on also necessarily, first of all, right?
No, it's up to you. And
okay.
If you can ask a particular speaker or just in general.
Okay, yeah, no, so just in general. Okay, so I have 2 little questions. Yeah, so first of all, do openly LGBT people, like gays and lesbians, etc. Yeah, so do they believe in man-made climate change more than straight people on average? So that's the first question. And sorry, the second question is, pardon me, is the climate change is Israel less visible in the climate realism world, our side, than let's say in Western Europe or North America? Because in Israel, as far as Israel is concerned, I only read about Nir Shaviv, but that's it. And on the Clintel website, I don't see any Israeli expert among more than 900 scientists who have signed the petition.
I can say real quick, there's also Nathan Powdor in Israel. But you're right. I don't know. I haven't heard of anyone else besides those 2 that I'm aware of. And in terms of the LGBTQ, I have no clue. I've never actually seen polling based on sexual preference about climate change. I've just never seen that. I don't know that any exists. It might.
Yeah, I'll address that LGBTQ one. The belief in climate change is predominantly left-wing. And so, it's interesting, people on the left and people on the right, they tend to accept a whole laundry list of ideals. And one of them is the belief in dangerous man-made climate change. Now, I have friends who are gay who are recognizing climate scare is ridiculous. But I think that in general, what you find is that people on the left of the political spectrum just accept it, not necessarily knowing why, but because it's part of their tribal mind. It's part of the tribal approach to agreeing with everything on a particular point of view. So I find often, though, when you talk to people personally, if they're not extreme environmentalists and driven by postmodernism, you can usually pull them over. So I don't think it's a fixed position, but I think it's a general tendency.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So the next question, Jenny Ramirez. I know some of the questions was answered in the chat, but if you have another question, feel free to turn on your mic. So if Jenny is still there, you can ask your question now.
Sounds like she is.
Okay, I don't think she's still here. So Catherine, if you'd like to turn your mic on, you can ask your question.
Well, I have a few, but I'll start with, it sounds like you're from the States, Mark. So my question was to do with the Green Party.
The passport, COVID passports?
No, just our different parties here in Canada, and we have
the Green Party. Oh, I think you said Green Card, Green Party. Okay,
Green
sure.
Party, and
yes.
And then sort of, I was like, well, what's up with them? They just have this. I mean, I saw Elizabeth May with the Agenda 21 handbook a number of years ago. So is it just all corrupt, and they have this agenda? And then just in line with that is, how do we throw out these leaders? As they're wanting to bring on internment camps and passports and such, that's going to then lead to these climate measures as well.
Okay, so what's your question for me? Because I'm not that versed on the Canadian political system with the Green Party. I'm not sure what your question is.
Right. Well, yeah, that's why I didn't think you'd be able to answer it. But I didn't know if you had any suggestions of how to throw out the leaders.
Of the Green Party? See,
not just the Green Party, just the leaders of leaders that are in power.
Yeah, my problem, again, I always like to say my problem is not with the UN, Al Gore, Greta Thunberg, or AOC. My problem is with my own, the people who are supposed to be fighting all this, supposed to be the opposition party. That, to me, is where the problem lies. And we have a leader in the House, Kevin McCarthy. They concede the entire narrative that climate's a problem. They need to come up with a solution. So they compete on solutions, which they will always lose because the progressive left is always going to have the most lavish, well-funded, attractive solution to people, whereas the other side, so they're just weak fighters. So it's a very difficult thing. I think the thing to do is you have to give them cover. You have to show up at town hall meetings and you have to tell them you want them to stand up to this. You have to reward courage. It's a very difficult thing because there's very few politicians who want to stand up to the media, to academia, and to institutions, even like NASA and the United Nations. They're few and far between, and certainly by the time they get to your party leadership, they're weak as they're very not forceful by that point and completely capitulate. So I'm still struggling with it here. That's why I'm so pessimistic. I just see this as our opposition party rolling over on the permanent lockdowns and the morphing into climate lockdowns, just because we have pathetic opposition party here in Washington, led by Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy. And again, I can't really answer for what's going on in Canada. I'm sure Tom knows a lot more than that.
Yeah, I can say a little bit about it. I've debated Elizabeth May a few times actually on television, and what I find is that she is driven by postmodernism. So I think it's pretty near impossible to bring her over to climate realism through the use of science and logic. And I think a lot of people in her environment are actually driven by postmodernism. But, one of the things that we're doing at ICSC Canada, and again, I encourage people to go to our website, that little box you can fill in, put your email address in, and we'll keep you up to date. One of the things we're going to be doing is encouraging politicians to adapt a new approach to climate change, and not denying it or saying that it's not real or not serious, but basically saying that we can't stop it, it's natural, so we have to learn to adapt to climate change. So a policy that focuses on adaptation allows them to avoid the slander of being called climate change deniers. And of course, it's interesting because in Canada, only 13% of our federal expenditure on climate change goes to adaptation. And there are people in different parts of Canada and the world, of course, who need help adapting to natural climate change. It's interesting, when I was at the Copenhagen Climate Conference, and I was there with Mark, and we caused some trouble. It was fun. Many of the Africans were actually quite appalled with the whole process, because worldwide, it's only 5% of the money that's going to adaptation. So the Africans were saying, we don't know the causes of climate change. We're not climate scientists, but we do know that we need help adapting to whatever is happening. You know, things like building wells and doing things that help people with real living. And they say, you people are all focused on what might happen in 50 years. We need help today. So I think there's a moral argument that can be made that we should be transferring funds from mitigation, the impossible objective to try to stop climate change, moving it over to adaptation. Not necessarily all of it, because we don't want to spend $1 billion a day on adaptation either, which is the amount going into mitigation. But I think that is an approach we should be pushing politicians, and certainly here at ICSC Canada, we're going to be pushing them to move their focus over to a real approach that'll help real people, namely adaptation to climate change, whatever the cause of climate change is.
Yeah, just real quick, I do agree. Actually, I mean, I sort of wanted to clarify that. Yes, Tom is exactly right. If we actually faced a climate crisis, you would do the opposite of the Green New Deal and UN climate treaties. You would want free markets, innovation, technological development, because a wealthier society can deal with anything the climate can throw at you, regardless of the cause. So the way to use it is not say a solution to climate change, say the way forward, whether you believe climate is natural or man-made, is the following. And that's where it is. So in this developing world, you want to build everything, the dams and dikes, and be ready for sea level rise, and build structures that can withstand storms. And this is where the future lies. And if the countries are allowed to do this, they'll do just fine, because Africa, Asia, they're all projected to become very wealthy and catch up with us over the next 100 years. The biggest threat they face is climate policy, restricting the world through this net zero nonsense and repressing us.
Yeah, exactly. It's very much like an ocean liner approaching a storm. And so the captain orders all of the crew and the passengers into lifeboats. I mean, it makes no sense at all. Weakening your society, reducing the resilience of your society by getting rid of the least expensive, most affordable, most reliable forms of energy makes us more vulnerable. So that whatever climate change occurs, natural or otherwise, we will be more vulnerable because we'll have less energy and less security. So, you know, in a way, as I say, it's like putting people in lifeboats when they should be staying in the big ship because a storm's coming. So whether you believe a storm's coming or not, we should not be abandoning ship just because of climate change. I mean, that's the exact opposite what we should be doing.
Great, thanks. And so we have a few more people with questions. So next, David Pelly, if you still have a question, you can ask it now.
I want these guys to talk about these forest fires in BC and California and wherever else they're occurring.
So I'll give you a quick answer. One of the fundamental ideas is that as CO2 rises and temperature rises, we'll see more forest fires. Like so much in the climate change debate, they actually have it upside down. As temperatures rise, and we're not talking about, you know, tens of degrees, we're talking about small increments in temperature, like 1 or 2 degrees. As temperatures rise, there's more evaporation, so there's more precipitation, so we end up with more soil moisture. The other one, which I was surprised to learn about from CO2 experts, is that as CO2 rises in the atmosphere, the pores on plants, which are called stomata, don't have to stay open as long, and so as a consequence, they actually lose less water to the environment, so more soil moisture stays in the soil. So both of those factors increase soil moisture and so actually reduce the incidence of fires. What we're seeing in Greece, for example, right now, and by the way, Greece has always had fires. If you look at Homer's Odyssey, you can see he talks about wildfires. But what they're finding is they're arresting a lot of arsonists. In fact, in the United States, something like 84% of all fires are caused by people. Okay, so obviously that has nothing to do with climate change. What they really need to do, though, is have better forest maintenance, where they actually do a better job of clearing the underbrush. Because naturally, before Europeans came to North America, we had huge fires in North America, far more than we have now. we would have a whole state in the United States, for example, covered with fire, and it would spread until it hit a natural barrier like the Rocky Mountains or the Mississippi River. And those fires, generally speaking, were called crown fires. They would rip through a forest, they would take out all the underbrush, but they wouldn't kill the trees. What we do now by suppressing fires and not clearing the underbrush is we leave the forest as a tinderbox waiting to ignite. So that's what we really need to do. If we're going to extinguish fires and not let them burn naturally, we have to do a far better job of forest maintenance. In British Columbia, they were estimating $5-6 billion required for forest maintenance just to get started. So it's much easier for politicians to blame it on climate change than to put it into forest maintenance.
Yeah, and I would just add, if you go back, wildfires were much worse 100 years ago. All over in California, droughts, previous centuries had droughts that went on, nearly 100 years. So nothing they're facing now is even comparable. However, wildfires are a terrible climate metric, but there was a 2020 study by Bjorn Lomborg, and about global wildfire. Deforestation has reduced the amount of forest. It's likely the fires in the forest have declined, even in the percentage of remaining forest areas across the past century. So there is what they've done, and this is true of all extreme weather, and it's important to understand this. Anywhere on the globe, you're going to have a record broken, whether it's a heat wave or a flood, hurricane, drought. There's always going to be a record climate event or weather event somewhere. So the media, climate activists, academia, UN will point out, oh, look at that, a record here, a record here. This is all record breaking. This is unprecedented. Now, think about state lotteries. If you every single day were a media bent on reporting all the lottery winners, and every day you said, look at this person won the lottery, he won 400,000, this one won 2.2 million, and you could do, after a year, you would have the impression that literally everyone is winning the lottery, that there's all these people, you see them daily, nightly, all of them are lottery winners. That's exactly what they're doing with extreme weather. They've bastardized the science to make you think that everywhere is a record, when in reality, records are broken all the time. But if you look at the actual trends on climate timescales, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, there is either no trend or declining trend. Even in this new UN IPCC report, what do? They do the old misdirection. They end up with extreme scenarios, and they admit that all of this, other than I think it was heat waves and one other category that they claim are increasing, that it's going to get so much worse. Just you wait. It's going to be so much worse in the future. That's how they do it. So don't get caught up in this. If you look at the actual extreme weather, we are living in a golden age right now, and they can always find a trend, a short-term trend, like California wildfires have increased since 2014. But if they look at it at 30, 50, 100-year, or even 500-year timescales, they can't make the same claim.
Yeah, that's excellent. I agree totally. And I'll just add one thing is when insurance companies show increasing claims due to extreme weather like hurricanes, what they're not telling you, of course, is there's a lot more things to be damaged. Dr. Tad Murty, who was an expert he passed away recently, unfortunately, but he pointed out that in the last century, there's been a 13-fold increase in infrastructure across the world. So, for example, in Florida, where 100 years ago you'd have one hotel in the way of a hurricane, you now have 13. So you obviously are going to get a lot more damage, even if the actual event is not more severe. So that's the main thing to realize. You got observational bias, like Mark was saying, but you also have this business of more infrastructure to be damaged, so charges and claims will be higher.
Yeah, great. Thank you for your question and great answer. So next question is Rosemary. You can ask your question.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's been a plethora of information. My question to you is, with Bill Gates and the likes, what do they have a picture at the end game, or are they going to be freezing their bodies too so that they can live into the eternity? And number two, how is the 5G ramping up, turning that on, going to be affecting our climate? Thank you.
I don't know. Okay, I don't know about the 5G. I mean, 5G is the biggest threat from 5G, as far as I can see. Is it just gives the tech giants more power of surveillance and different means like that. I don't get into the other stuff with 5G. But you asked about an end game. The end game is very simple. CNBC analyst Jim Cramer said that 2020 saw the greatest transfer of wealth from the poor and middle class to the wealthy. Billionaire class benefited about as much as the middle and lower class, the poorer classes lost in wealth. It was just a massive transfer. So they get more money, they get more power. But in the case of someone like Bill Gates, you say how much money, power can they get? I think it's beyond that, and the same with Jeff Bezos and others. It's a conceit of they believe the administrative state is the way to go. They want to remake society, remake civilization. They want experts, bureaucratic control by experts on every aspect of your life because they actually think it's more efficient. This is the way they look at the world. So they're imposing their worldview, and they're getting to do it. And they don't see that hypocrisy. It's a blind spot. Same with Al Gore, same with Leonardo DiCaprio flying private jets and having multiple homes, and then telling other people they have to do with less. That happened with James Cameron. We have to do with less. And he owned a submarine and multiple homes, and he had traveled around the world nonstop. But the same is happening here, where Bill Gates is saying we need to extend the lockdown, we need more severe lockdown, and he's flying around his private jet, buying private jet transport companies. They believe that the world needs to be controlled. It's an ideology. It's an administrative state. Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States in 1914, set up the League of Nations, believed in that administrative state. They thought they were doing a great benefit for humanity. So if you want to think Bill Gates is a good guy, this is his world philosophy, and he's in the right place in time and history to make it happen. And that's what he's doing. And I think that's really what's behind it. Frederick Hayek called it the conceit, where people actually believe that freedom is the enemy. People living lives are messy. They harm the planet. They're getting sick. They're bad for viruses. It's bad for society. So you bring in the experts, they study it, and they impose rules, and everything's nice and orderly. That's the world vision of Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates, and that's what we're facing. And it's very hard to fight because they're doing it for our own good.
Yeah, the focus on world government is actually one of the underlying drivers of the climate scare, because if you control CO2, then you control the world's energy to a large extent. If you control the world's energy, you control the world.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Rosemary. So next question is Ursula. You can turn on your mic and ask the question.
I wanted to ask, do you have any ideas on how to undo the indoctrination that's going on in our schools? Because that's part of the problem. I have to say, I'm in the educational setting, and I fell hook, line, and sinker for a lot of the climate change concepts, and they are extremely deeply ingrained in the educators from, elementary, kindergarten level all the way to university. So I want to know, do you have any successful ideas or strategies on how to combat that indoctrination in the educators? And then part two is, how do we reach the youth? Because I mean, this is going to be an ongoing battle, and how do we get to the youth? Anything that you've seen that has been successful in order to have some change going on in this?
I work for a Committee for Constructive Tomorrow. We have a collegiate division that goes out to colleges. We've had Patrick Moore, we've had other climate skeptics, Roy Spencer speak. That's one of the most important things. But if I have in both my books, Politically Incorrect Guide, Green Fraud, I have two chapters, one chapter in each book on children indoctrination. We know Leonardo DiCaprio said you got to get kids young. We know that Al Gore's producer said we want you to grow up to be activists. So from kindergarten through college, they're indoctrinated. I would just say this. First of all, don't worry too much about that, because if you go back to the 1960s, you had the flower children and the hippies. Most people outgrow that. They're going to outgrow this insane, alarm that, Greta Thunberg, I want you to be afraid. No, we want you to think. as Naomi says, the opposite of Greta, the climate the climate
Naomi's
skeptic.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, Naomi's right. So this is where we are. Don't worry too much about that, but I would say exposure kids. I did 2 movies featuring Tom Harris, featuring a lot of his members in the Canadian International Climate Coalition. The movies were shown in schools. I've talked to high schools about it. The books, just teach your kid that you don't have to teach them you must believe this on climate, but just say, hey, there's more to the story than they're telling you, and make sure they have alternative sources, and do it young. You can do it. All the kids that my kids know, they laugh at this stuff. It doesn't even have any impact on them whatsoever. Once you see through it, you realize you're being indoctrinated, and you can do it. And kids in elementary school can see through it.
Yeah, and I think it's also good to get young people more and more involved. Naomi Seip from Germany, she's about 23, something like that. I'll put a link to her webpage in the chat here. She's a really outstanding speaker. There's a new rapper out called Tom McDonald out of Vancouver, and he attacks many of the woke ideas. And I'm not kidding. He gets 7 to 10 million views. So I'm trying to get him actually to attack the climate alarmism through his rap videos. There was a German rap video a rap expert at one of the Heartland conferences. So I think that's one of the keys, is getting young people actually telling other young people, this is nonsense. So I'll put Naomi's link on here, as well as Tom McDonald. If you can avoid some of the swearing, he actually is hitting millions of people. So if we can get him doing what the German rapper was doing at the Heartland conference, that would be great.
Great, thank you. And thank you everyone for your questions. So I believe Brian had to leave and Jay's also not here, but if Tom or Mark, if you have any concluding words to end the panel, feel free to go ahead.
Okay, I don't have much to say. I just think right now the greatest thing we can do is you have to defy and resist. Join protests. The fight against permanent COVID lockdowns is the same fight against imposing climate restrictions on all of us. This is now no longer left or right. And I'm working on a new project. This is where we are. It used to be the left versus the right and all that. Now it's up or down, whether it's freedom or tyranny. And I'm welcoming. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., to my face, told me in an interview in 2014 at the New York Climate March, he said, climate skeptics belong in jail at The Hague with all the other war criminals, 3 square meals and 3 hot meals and a cot. I now forgive him openly. He is now one of the leading voices against COVID lockdowns, and he's fighting this, and he's fighting it. He's going to rallies. He's taking great risks. He's got their own Hollywood liberal communities turned against him. I welcome Naomi Wolf, the feminist, into this. I welcome Bill Maher, the liberal comedian. I now think that we need to unite with people who in the past we thought were our political enemies. This is a whole realignment of politics. I now look at politics much differently. I'll tell you this, a lot of what Bernie Sanders says about, the billionaire class and ruling it, Bernie Sanders is a hypocrite because he does not fighting it, but a lot of what he says is applicable to fighting the Great Reset. So you've got to reorient yourself. This is no longer a left-right conservative world. I might be shocking people by saying that, but that's now, the last 18 months, I've realigned significantly. I am now following a lot of not progressive, but liberals who I never thought I would in the past, and they're now my allies. In fact, I've had conversations with Naomi Wolf now, so it's an amazing thing.
Yeah, I wanted to expand a little on that. The idea that the left are our enemies on this is a mistake. I mean, there are many people on the left who are starting to recognize there's something wrong with the climate scare. And I'll just give you an example. In the IPCC report that just came out, the word unequivocal is used 33 times in the main report. Hey, you got a nice dog there. And I'll just read to you one of the quotes, and I'll read a response from Stephen Goldman, who's on the left of the political spectrum, who generally agrees with the climate scare, and David Wojcik, who's on the right. You'll see they both cut up the UN for these kinds of statements. The statement is, and here's one of the 33 times unequivocal is used in the UN report that just came out. Warming of the climate system is unequivocal, as is now evidenced from observations of increases in global average air temperature and ocean temperatures. widespread melting of snow and ice and rising sea levels, rising global average sea level. Now, of course, that's silly because you don't make observations of average anything. You don't make observations of average air temperature or ocean temperature or sea level. All it is a statistical computation based on observations of thousands of measurements around the world. But the point I wanted to make here is that Stephen Goldman, who's a Lehigh University philosophy professor, he actually supports the climate scare, but he says that this particular kind of statement is ridiculous. He says it's an attempt to persuade extra-logically. Strictly logically, no observations can lead to an unequivocal interpretation. Now, that's an important point because unequivocal means there is no possible other explanation. Yeah. It is the truth. It is universal, necessary, and certain. That's what Plato defined as being true. And yet philosophers throughout history they've recognized that observations are not truth in that sense. Observations are particular, contingent, and probable. They're the very opposite of universal, necessary, and certain. So you can use the philosophy of the truth and the problems with unequivocal to actually defeat it. Here's what David Wojcik said, and he opposes the dangerous global warming hypothesis. He said, reasoning from evidence is inductive logic. As for unequivocal, that is never the case in inductive logic. So we can use the left-wing types of arguments from philosophers to defeat a major point in the whole UN report. The idea that these things are unequivocal. No, they're not. They can't even possibly be unequivocal because science is always based on an interpretation of observations, which is never unequivocal. So, I mean, there are many attack points you can use against the UN report. Many of the things they're saying just are not true. But at the same time, you can use philosophy of science to completely rip it up. And that's where we actually can get people on the left over more to our side, in my opinion.
Great, thank you so much. And I'd like to thank our panelists once again for such an enlightening discussion. And I'd encourage everyone to check out the links that I posted and Tom posted in the comments section. There you can learn more about the different panelists and check out some of the articles they've written. And hopefully this was very helpful to you. And we will also have this available as a recording. So when that comes out, the link will be shared to everyone who joined. All right, well, thank you again, everyone, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Mary Jane. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. That was fun.
It was great. Thanks.